Welcome to the Snowpoint Cast. In this video, we're going to be talking about how to start playing Pokemon TCG formats from the past. So if you want to start playing Pokemon TCG formats of old, you have a couple of options. The first of which, and the easiest of all the options I'm going to be talking about, is buying the World Championship decks. So every year after the World Championships in August, Pokemon puts out 4 decks that did well from the World Championships. And sometimes that works out really well. Like in this particular case, these are 2019 Worlds decks. And I really enjoy these ones. They're fun to play against one another. They have some really interesting interactions. And the ones from 2017 Worlds have some pretty decent matchups as well. But there are some issues with the decks that Pokemon puts out themselves. So the first issue is the decks might not match up very well against one another. Often there's a best deck in format or a BDIF, and that deck usually gets printed. And the issue with that is when you print a BDIF, the reason that it's the best deck in the format is it has positive matchups against every other deck, or in theory it should. And that just doesn't make for as fun of games, right? Like when you're playing a negative matchup all the time, it just, instead of being 50-50 odds where you can outplay your opponent, you have to play against weakness and inherent, like, sometimes decks are just really good against one another. Like, for example, in 2006, the first place deck locks trainers, and a bunch of other decks from that format relied on trainers to set up. So when you print that deck, it just kind of like invalidates a bunch of really fun decks that you could play. So that's the first issue. Sometimes the decks don't match up well against one another. And the other issue is list quality. So sometimes the deck lists aren't that great. What Pokemon usually does is they'll print like the first place Masters deck, the first place Seniors deck, the first place Juniors deck, and another deck. So this is the second place one from Masters this year, and that's usually what they do. But depending on the year, there can be some really bad lists. Like, for example, in this year, the Pikarom list, this is the Juniors one, the one that got first in Juniors. And the issue with this list, it was actually not that great. So it was okay. You know, it was an all right list, but there was a much better one for Masters in top 8. So I just, bought the deck list and then changed out a few cards so that I had access to a better list. And sometimes you can definitely modify the list a little bit to make it better. But in other cases, you have to gut the entire list. Like in 2006, the World's decks that they printed, the Juniors one was an LBS list, a Lugia Blastoise Steelix list, and that list was hot garbage. It didn't play any Holland's Cast form, which is like the backbone engine of the deck. It played one Professor Elm's training method, which is just like gross because that's so important to the consistency of the deck. So sometimes you just have to gut the entire list. And at that point, why not just get lists of your own? Like, there's way better options. So before we get into what deck lists and formats to build, it is important to know what your budget is, because Pokemon can be really expensive depending on what kind of format you'd like to get into. So the first format that we're going to be talking about, or not the first format, the first option in terms of budget that we're going to be talking about is the low end. So like the $40 to $80 budget. If you don't have that much money, but you still want to start playing Pokemon, I would recommend that you proxy. So this is a proxy deck that I did. It's a Polytoad EX deck, and it's entirely fake. So for those that don't know, proxying is when you take a printout of a card and then have a real card behind it just so that it can shuffle well. And then you just start playing with the deck. So I started off all of my, like when I started playing 2006, all 6 of my decks were fully proxied. It's a great way to just jump right into the game. You don't have to wait for cards to come in or anything like that. And it's great because it lets you select any format as well. Like, you're not restricted by, wow, the cards from 2006 or the cards from 2010 are so pricey. I don't want to drop a ton of money to play a really good format. Proxying lets you get into those format without worrying about the massive cost. So that's kind of on the lower end if you're looking to keep things cheap. In the middle end, we have 2014 States format. So 2014 States is a great format, and you can keep it pretty cheap. Like, you can keep it to $200 because a lot of the EXs, which are the more expensive cards in that format, got reprinted as promos. So because of that, even the regular EXs are worth like $3 sometimes. Like, I know Darkrai EX has a ton of reprints, and it's worth like $3 right now. But you can also, if you want to, bling out your decks a little bit with a full art. So this Jirachi X is a full art from that format. It's a gorgeous card. I really love that Jirachi. But if you would like to, you can buy a bunch of full arts. And the full arts are really nice looking. So depending on how much money you have, like if you have more like $400 or $500, it lets you potentially buy those more expensive decks because of the full arts. So that's another option that you have, kind of in the middle range. And the last option that we're going to be talking about is the more expensive one and the most expensive one, and it's building the GOAT formats. So GOAT formats, GOAT, for those of you who don't know, stands for greatest of all time. And the two formats that exist for that are 2006 and 2010. So they're widely regarded as the best formats just because they're so fun to play against one another and they're so interactive. Like there's so many interesting decks in these formats and they're all so cool. So it's kind of hard to price, so that's why I put it in the 100+ range, is because the market has been fluctuating a lot over the last couple years. It's been really up and down. One of my buddies, Jonathan Perenata, he's just a guy in the Pokemon TCG community. He plays a big part in like old format. He knows a lot about old decks. I asked him, he bought 12 decks, 12 2006 decks, like real decks, all the cards for the decks. I think this was back in like 2016 or 2017, and I asked how much he paid for it, and he said he paid like 3 to 4K. So, you know, if you have that kind of budget to blow on cards, by all means, I would definitely say do that, because the arts from this format are so cool. Like the level X's are amazing, and the EXs are really, really neat as well. So that's a great part about this format, is the arts are really neat. But it is kind of tough to price it out because of how the market's been fluctuating. And honestly, old format Pokemon has been getting a lot more popular over the past 2 years. So as time goes on, you can only really expect those prices to go up. So the next thing we're going to start talking about is how to start picking and building decks. Now that you're informed on the cost for each format, I would definitely recommend, before we get into like picking decks, I would definitely recommend starting with 4, especially if you're new to the Pokemon TCG. 4 just lets you have kind of an idea on the format, but also lets you play with 4 people at a time. And that's definitely really nice to have a bit of a mix, not having to play the same decks against one another. If you only have 2 decks, kind of keeps it gets stale after a while. So yeah, if you go with 4, that's great. And then you could advance to 6 off of 4 if you do end up liking the format that you build. So you can build 4, and then there's 2 other decks that you can build, and then you get up to 6. And when you get to 6 decks, I do really think that 6 is a great number for decks because it lets you buy this. So this is the Ultimate Guard Archive deck box holder, and I carry all of my old format decks in this. So it fits 6 deck boxes really, really cleanly. And then it kind of like the magnet is pretty hard as well. So I'm just gonna it's like not super easy to pull. So it just keeps your cards safe. And I find, especially if you're investing a lot of money in this format, it's good to invest in some safety for your cards because they are made of paper. So you never know what's gonna happen. So back to picking decks. So I recommend picking decks with close matchups compared to like the BDIF, like I was saying. So the problem with the BDIF is that usually it has positive matchups against a bunch of other stuff. Like, for example, in 2006, they printed Mutrick, which is like the best deck in format in 2006, pretty widely regarded. And it has really good matchups against a lot of the format. It should win against most of the format. But the issue with that is there's a ton of the format that's so cool that just gets like shut off because that best deck in format is so powerful. Like the stage 2 decks and all the decks that are like kind of neat, in my opinion, a lot of them lose to Mutrick. So that's kind of one of the flaws of playing the best deck in format or building the best deck in format, is sometimes you have to play a matchup that's skewed too heavily in one favor. And in my opinion, it's more fun to play matchups that are close. So speaking of close matchups, let's get into the first one of 2 recommendations that I'm going to recommend you build. So the first format is 2014 States. So 2014 States is really great. It's one of my favorite formats. I do enjoy it a lot. The 4 decks that I'm going to recommend you build first off are Dark Garb, VG or Virizion Genesect, Big Basics Raichu Garb, and then Plasma. So these decks are all really fun, and they all like did pretty well the year that they were played. This deck got first at Nats. This deck got first and second at Worlds, and then both of these decks had notable finishes in the States and Worlds format. So they're really fun, and they all have close-ish matchups, you know, other than Plasma. Plasma has a little bit of an advantage against Dark and VG. Honestly, it stomps VG, but other than that, like these 2 decks are pretty even against one another, and these 2 decks and these 2, and you know, all the other decks have pretty close matchups, and that's really fun to play because you don't have to worry about getting mollywopped depending on what deck you pick. And it's a great format if you're going to teach younger players as well. A lot of the Pokemon in this format are basic Pokemon, so it's really easy to just say, okay, this is an EX, it's a basic, you need to attach energy to it, and then you can attack. So that's really easy to teach younger players. It's super easy to grasp if you're younger, so that's another advantage to this format. And the full arts are gorgeous. I just love the full arts for this format. Like this Darkrai, this Mewtwo are all like amazing cards. When they did the next Destinies to like, I think it was like to XY era, all of the full arts were just so good looking. And there's 2 other decks that you can build as well. So these are the 4 that I would recommend initially, but if you want to get a little bit deeper, you can also build Blastoise and Raybor. So these are 2 really fun decks as well. They go off Emboar and Blastoise, so they both let you just break the energy attach rule. Blastoise says you can attach as many waters as you want from your hand every turn, and Emboar says you can do the same with fires. So they're kind of interesting decks that let you break the rules. And another great part about this format is it's really easy to find all these cards. Like a ton of them have promos. So this Yveltal has a promo, this Darkrai has a promo, this Keldeo has a promo, these 2 cards have promos, and the other important EX from this deck has a promo. This Mewtwo has a promo, and this Rayquaza has a promo. So like if you would like to, you don't have to buy the full art cards. You can keep it cheap, but get the real cards. I do like having shiny cardboard. You know, proxying is okay, but shiny cardboard is one of the big reasons that I play Pokemon. So being able to get those real cards is definitely really cool. Some of the downsides with this format, there's not really a ton, but there's 2 that I'm going to talk about. So the first one is the decks aren't as complex as the decks from the next formats that I'm going to be talking about. So they're a little bit more linear because they're basic Pokemon. You know, as soon as you get the matchups down, you kind of know what you need to do, and your ability to outplay your opponent goes down the more both of you know a matchup. And in that way, it kind of stales a little bit faster. It's still really fun, and I still even play it now. Like I played Standard in this format, but I still just play these decks for fun now, but it can stale a little bit sooner. So that's kind of one of the downsides. And the other downside is the supporters that are played in this format. So all of these decks play a 4/4 line, not a 4/4, but most of them play a 4/4 of Juniper and N. So Professor Juniper, discard your hand and draw 7. It's just a straight draw card, really, really powerful draw card. And the other card that's pretty staple is N. So N is both players shuffle their hand into their deck and then draw for their prize cards. So they're really good supporter cards, but the issue with these supporter cards is they can make for, you know, hit or miss turns where you're like, okay, I'm going to Juniper for 7. And then you Juniper for 7 and it's like, well, I missed even though I drew 7. So that's kind of frustrating. Or like you get N to 6 and you're like, okay, cool, I got 6 cards. Hopefully I'll hit, and then sometimes you just don't. So that's kind of frustrating, especially when some of the other formats have like direct search. Like they say cards that like, say, do this and then search your deck for blank. And just being able to search makes you a lot more consistent. So that's one of the only downsides to this format. But I do really enjoy this format. I think it's one of the best formats out there. And the full arts are gorgeous. There's just so many pluses to this format. And it's just like, it's really fun. Super fun format. Okay, so the next format that we're going to be talking about are the GOAT formats. So the first 4 decks from 2006 that I'm going to introduce. So Rocklock is the first one, Ludicargo, Dragtrode, and then Queendom. So these 4 decks are really fun to play against one another, and they are all stage 2 decks, so they rely on rare candy, and they're because of that, like if you play Mutrick, which is the best deck in the format in this deck, honestly, all these decks get wrecked by Mutrick, and they're all really fun. So that's kind of one of the downsides of building the best deck in the format. So those are the 4 that I would recommend from 2006. And then as for 2010, the 4 that I would recommend is Gyarados, Luxchomp, Dialgachomp, and GG, which stands for Gardeglade. So these 4 decks are really fun as well, and they all did really well at the World Championships the year that they came out. All of these decks did well at the World Championships, so you know that they're good. And the 2010 ones are really nice as well because, again, those level X cards are so cool. And that's another benefit to the building 2006 as well. Like the EXs and level Xs from this format are so cool. Another bonus to this format is you get to evolve. So in 2014 states, there are a bunch of basic Pokemon, and there are some decks that utilize evolutions, but there's none that like revolve around their main attacker being evolutions, and all of these decks have like main attackers as evolutions. So that's great. And these formats also let you adapt really easily to one another. So for example, when you're playing against another deck in 2006, there's a lot of interesting interactions, and as you play more, it lets you discover more about the format. And as you discover more, you become a better player. So as you're becoming a better player, it just lets you like dive deeper into the format. So you're like, oh, I understand this about this format that I didn't understand before. And now that I understand this one part of the format, it potentially lets me understand other parts of the format. And it's just like the depth to these formats is really, there's a lot of depth here. So these are the 4 decks that I would recommend in each format. If you're looking to build bonus decks for each format, the 2 decks I would recommend is LBS. And so LBS is a really cool deck. It did really, really well at the World Championships, and Meta Knight, which also did really well at the World Championships. Both super fun decks, really good as well. Also stage 2 decks. And then for 2010, I would recommend Jumpluff, which won juniors in 2010, and Kurskar. So all these decks are really cool, and they're one of the greatest parts about these formats is all these decks are so unique. They all have very different strategies, and often a lot of them play different supporter cards. Like there's staple supporter cards that every deck needs to play, but there is adaptability where you can play other supporter cards instead of just relying on N and Juniper like 2014 states. So the uniqueness is a really good part of this format. The downsides to these format is if you are going to buy real cards, it is very expensive. They are really popular formats. So because of that, the card prices have gone up, and it's like kind of ridiculous now, to be honest. I know like Dialga's worth, like this Dialga G is worth like $45 or something stupid like that. And the other issue is some staple cards can be difficult to find. Even if you do have the money, some of the cards, because the formats are so popular, it can be difficult to find those cards that you need to actually build out a deck. So these formats are great to be proxied as well. If you're thinking about potentially proxying, I would definitely go with one of these 2 formats. They're really, really fun, and they're probably my favorite. 2006 is definitely my favorite format of all time. It's the format that I started playing. So I proxied these 6 decks exactly in 2017. I started exactly when like JP started playing. So when I built all 4 of these decks, they were just like proxied. I had a few cards, but maybe like 95% of it was proxied. And over time, you can just like fill it out. So like say you want real cards, but you don't really have a choice but to proxy for now because of your money. You can just proxy and then over time buy cards. Like the reverses in this era, this Nidoqueen, for example, that holofoil on the like the Pokeball, I don't even see that. The Pokeball on the card, that's the reverse from the era. So it's like really, really cool reverses. And as you like fill out the decks, you can just find the cards that are shiny that you like. You're like, oh, well, I got, 80% of this deck is proxied, but the 20% that isn't is all shiny Pokemon that I like. So it's pretty much a real deck. I also did, so like I said before, I did a proxy tutorial, and I'm going to link that in the description. I also have deck list videos for all of these decks. I'm going to drop those in the description as well. So if you want to find a deck list for any of these decks, I'm going to leave them in the description. But yeah, there's tons of old formats to explore, and it's really easy with proxying to just like pick a format and dive into it. So I'm just going to take a quick second here to shout out Dustin Zimmerman. So Dustin Zimmerman is a buddy of mine. He's from Indianapolis, and he's a really good Pokemon player, actually. He got top 4 Worlds in 2013. He's a very, very good player. But he actually did the logo design for the Snowpoint cast. And it's a really, really good logo. I love this logo a lot. I'm actually just going to gush about it for a second. So in the actual Pokemon games, when you walk up to the Snowpoint Temple, there's 4 pillars, and then there's like a top bar and then stairs. And at the rightmost pillar, there's a crack in the pillar, and you just like put that on the logo. I don't know. He's just a really talented graphic artist who has a lot of passion for the work that he does. So if you have any graphic art needs, definitely check him out. I'm going to link his Twitter in the bio or in the description. So definitely check him out. He did the Indy 500 logo. So Mans actually he knows what he's doing. Yeah. So Dustin Zimmerman, really, really nice guy. And he did the logo. Shout outs to him. He did a really good job on that. But yeah, this has been how to play old format. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.